Hi guys, and welcome back to another true crime and makeup time video. If you're new here, my name is Zara and I post a new true crime video every single week. So if you love makeup and you love true crime, definitely hit that notification bell button so you don't miss any videos of mine, and leave a comment down below letting me know what you want to see next, guys. So I came across today's case because I was just listening to some true crime podcasts, and I'm the type of person that likes to listen to the same case a couple times. I don't know if you guys are like that, but a couple cases that I always listen to. The Jennifer Pan case, which I actually did a video on like back in the day, maybe a year or so ago. So check that out if you haven't seen that video, because that case is so interesting. The next one is obviously the Chris Watts case. I feel like I always want to know more and what drove him to do that. So that's how I came across today's case. And I kept getting an ad for this case. Like, it kept popping up as a link. So I ended up reading it and I was just like, wow, I can't even believe things like this even happen. And it seemed almost like fake. But if you guys haven't heard of Larry Gene Bell, let's get into it. Larry was an evil man because not only did he commit evil crimes, after he would kill his victims, he would contact the family to taunt and terrorize them. So I like to start off my cases by giving a background of the people we're talking about. But with Larry, there's really not much known. His full name was Larry Gene Bell, and he was born on the 30th of October 1949, and he had 4 siblings, 3 sisters and a brother, and him and his family, they would move around a lot. He went to Eau Claire High School in Columbia, South Carolina, and then his family moved to Mississippi where he completed high school. So after he graduated high school, he took up training to be an electrician. And then he ended up moving back to Columbia, South Carolina. And in 1972, he got married and he ended up having just one son. In 1970, when he was 21 years old, he joined the Marines. But he was discharged pretty much immediately because he accidentally shot himself in the knee with a gun when he was cleaning. So not very well equipped to be a Marine. So I mean, thank goodness. He would have shot someone else by accident. After he was discharged, he went to the Department of Corrections and worked as a prison guard, but only for a month. And then he moved to Rock Hill, South Carolina in 1972, where he lived with his wife and his son for a little while. But 1976, just 4 years later, him and his wife, they ended up just getting a divorce. So after that, there's really not much information I could find, and it just seemed like nothing really happened. And I don't know what happened with his son. I believe that his wife would have had full custody, because what I'm about to tell you, most likely he didn't have custody of his son. So let's move on to his victims and what he did to them. So Sharon Faye Smith was born on 25th June 1967. Her mom was Hilda and her dad was Robert Smith, called him Bob, and they were from Columbia in South Carolina. So her name was Sharon, but they called her Shari, and that's what she's known as, or Shari. She had an older sister named Dawn and a younger brother named Robert Jr. Shari's family was very close, and her sister in particular were very close. They really sounded like a genuinely close family, and they grew up riding horses, going to church and singing in the church choir, like very wholesome. They were a really well-known and influential family in the town, and I think that was due to their massive participation with the church and the community, and the kids also attended the church youth group. Shari was very pretty. She had this like beautiful bouncy blonde hair and these bright big blue eyes. Apart from her looks, she was also known to have a very vibrant, fun personality, and she was very kind. She was also voted the wittiest in her high school class. Now, although she was this gorgeous kind of growing teenager, she just had this like massive collection of koala bears, which kind of showed her childlike innocence. Her father, Robert, stated that Shari was the one that held the family together. She was the cement to their family. She was always happy, and she just kept the family close. On May 31st, 1985, Shari had plenty of reasons to be happy. She was 18 years old, and she was just 2 days away from her high school graduation. And she was actually supposed to be singing the national anthem at her graduation ceremony. And this is super cool. After her graduation, she was due to be going I don't know if it was with the class. I'm guessing it was with the class that graduated on a cruise to the Bahamas. Like, what? Who does that? How fun is that? Did any of you guys have a really big end to high school celebration? I know in Australia we do schoolies. Is that what we call it? Yeah, schoolies, where usually you kind of go away, but I wasn't allowed to, so I didn't do anything. So on that day, 31st of May, Shari spent the day just hanging out, and she went to a pool party with her friends. And Shari had a boyfriend, but there's not much really known about him. But after the pool party, her and her boyfriend, they go to the mall, and then after that, she drives home alone. At 3:30 p.m., she arrives home, and the suburb she lived in was Lexington. And her driveway, which I'm like, is this a rich neighborhood? Is Lexington a rich neighborhood? Because her driveway was apparently 200 meters long. Like, that is long. That's like a whole street, right? It's huge. So with her driveway being that long, obviously she wasn't going to park her car on the main road and then walk. So she was about to drive into her house, but she stops at the mailbox, the letter box, which was at the entrance of her driveway. And she was checking the mail and just going to bring in any mail that had arrived. Now, her father was at his office in the house, and I'm guessing the office was at the front of the home, so he can see Shari pulling in. So he sees her stop at the front of the driveway, and she gets out of the car and she walks to the mailbox. So as he sees her walking to the mailbox, he kind of like goes back and keeps doing what he's doing, assuming that she's going to check the mail and then she's going to get back in her car and drive the rest of the way into the house. So as he kept working, suddenly he's like, what's the time? It's been like 5-10 minutes. And Shari's not coming into the house. So he looks outside, he sees her car. But now he had this gut feeling that something just wasn't right. So he gets in his car. I mean, it's 200 meters. So he gets in his car and he drives to Shari's car. When he gets there, he gets out of his car and he sees Shari's car door is open. The motor is still running. And her purse is on the seat in the passenger side, but there's no Shari. He sees bare footprints leading from the car to the mailbox, but then there's no footprints back. And on the ground next to the mailbox, there's a bunch of mail just scattered on the floor. Shari had just vanished right before his eyes, literally. Her parents did not wait. They immediately called the police, and they reported that their daughter Shari had been abducted. Now, because this was a well-known family, they had, a good amount of money and they were quite influential. So they assumed that this abduction of their daughter was because of money, and they were waiting for a ransom call. From the beginning, her family was like, no, there's no chance that she just ran away or did something on her own, because she was genuinely happy in her life. She was about to graduate. She was about to go on this graduation cruise. She had a boyfriend. Like, everything was going well. She was happy. Also, she was diabetic. So there was no chance she would have left by herself without taking her medication with her. Her diabetes was called diabetes insipidus, which I've never heard of, but it's apparently a really rare form of diabetes, which requires massive hydration. Like, she needs to stay hydrated and take certain drugs. And her medicine is found in the car, in her purse. Now, when the police arrived, it looked like Shari had gone from her vehicle to the mailbox, and then as she was on her way back, she was snatched. That's why there were no footprints leading back, and that's also why the mail was found on the floor. Right away, the police set up a manhunt, and it was the largest manhunt at the time to take place, with the police even setting up a 24-hour command center right by their house. Despite this, they were unable to find anything to do with Shari's abduction. Now, you and I are talking about who took her, so we know who took her, but at the time when she was driving home from the mall, Shari had no idea that Larry Jean Bell was tailing her in his car. Shari's family was so worried, so sick, and they would make public pleas for Shari's abductor to just let her go. But all they could do was wait. They felt super helpless, and there was nothing they could really do. What can they do? Her father, Bob Robert, states that for the first time out in his life, he felt like he couldn't protect his family, and he felt like, what's the point of me? You know what I mean? Like, he couldn't even protect his household. 2 days go by with nothing. Shari vanished, and They don't have any leads. They can't figure out what happened. They don't even have any eyewitnesses. Nothing. Nothing. Then on the evening of June 2nd, they get a phone call. On the phone, it was an unknown man, and his voice had been distorted. He asked to speak to Shari's mother, Hilda. Hilda gets on the phone and he says, "Shari's with me." And to prove that he wasn't lying, he describes the black and yellow swimsuit that Shari had on under her clothes because she had been at a pool party. He confirmed this was not a prank. Hilda asks how Shari is and says, she's diabetic. He tells Hilda Shari's doing well. We're watching TV, but she now has the fear of God in her. He also said Shari's drinking plenty of water, but to arrange for an ambulance to be present when Shari returned home. Now, she had to drink a lot of water because of her diabetes, but I'm like, the medication wasn't with her. So how does he know that? Maybe she told him, but clearly she's not taking her medication. So while he's on the phone with them, he doesn't actually demand any money like they assumed. Instead, he says, "Oh, did you receive the letter I sent?" And when Hilda tells him, "Well, no, I didn't receive any letter. Like, what letter are you talking about?" He says, "Oh, don't worry, you're going to receive it in the morning." So the police, they rush out and go to the post office because they want to intercept this letter before it arrives to the Smith's residence. And while this man was on the phone, the police were able to trace the call 20 miles from Shari's house, but time wasn't on their side because by the time they were able to even pinpoint a precise location of the call, the man had hung up the call. So they weren't able to find his exact location, but they had a general radius. So at the post office, the police, they're combing through all the mail that was in, that area, and they kept looking and looking and looking. And then eventually they find the letter addressed to the Smith family. This letter that was sent by this man contained a 2-page letter, and this letter would not only devastate the family, but also served as a critical piece of evidence for this case. Now, Shari's dad had actually come to the post office with the police, so he was the first to read this letter, and although the letter's contents would devastate him, he did not lose hope that his daughter was going to come home alive. What he dreaded the most was actually having to show his wife, Hilda, and tell her about the contents of this letter. So this letter was sent to the crime lab, and over here it was going to be examined for any type of clues, any type of evidence. They were looking for fibers, fingers, handprints, saliva, or any discrepancies in the writing or the handwriting style. The letter was 2 pages in length and was written in Shari's handwriting on a yellow legal notepad. And this is sick. Across the top, he obviously made her write this. It stated, "Last will and testament of Shari Smith." On the left of this paper, it said June 1st, 1985. And on the right, it said 3:58 a.m., which was the time that she was writing this. And in Shari's loopy cursive handwriting, it said, in quite big writing, it said, "I love y'all." The letter really looked like, a teenage girl had written it, but the contents of it were so mature. I feel like the contents of the letter are worth reading, so I'm just going to read you a little bit of it just to get an idea of what she says. So it says, "I love you, Mommy, Daddy, Robert, Dawn, and Richard," which I think is her boyfriend, "and everyone else and all other friends and relatives. I will be with my father now, so please, please don't worry. Just remember my witty personality and great special times we all shared together. Please don't even let this ruin your lives. Just keep living one day at a time for Jesus. Some good will come out of this. My thoughts will always be with you and in you." I mean, can you imagine how her family felt? Even just through this letter, you can see how much love she had for her family. Even though she's in this position of a terrifying ordeal, we don't really know. To be abducted alone is enough. She cares about how her family feels. She's like, "You guys don't worry. You guys continue to live a normal life no matter what happens to me." It's quite mature. She urges her family to be there for one another and not to let this ordeal make them hard or too upset. What's also crazy is that I read in her letter she wrote like a request for her funeral for her casket to be closed. Now, why would she say that? You know, like, did Larry tell her what he was going to do to her? That she's like, I don't want anyone to see me and see what I'm going to look like after death? Like, scary. Now, we know it's Larry making these calls, and Larry, he enjoyed and thrived on this control that he exerted over the Smith family, especially the Smith women. And he made 8 telephone calls in total, and 7 of them were actually recorded. Back in the day, it took 15 minutes to trace a call, and he wouldn't really stay on the phone long enough to be traced. But one time, they almost got him because they traced the call to outside a shopping center, and when they got there, the man was gone. So he obviously knew, but at the same time, he made that mistake that one time, right? Because he stayed on the phone long enough to be traced. Every time he made these phone calls, he would distort his voice, number one, and he would just make like obscene comments, or he would talk about revelations from God. After the letter was sent, he then asks Hilda, Shari's mom, did you receive the letter from Shari? And they responded, yes, we did. And he then asks, well, do you believe me? Do you believe that I have Shari? And Hilda responds with, well, I don't really know. I haven't heard from Shari. I don't know if she's okay. I don't know anything. Larry responds with, well, you'll find out in 2 to 3 days. And every time he would call, he would ask to speak to Hilda, Shari's mom, but then soon he wanted to speak to Dawn, Shari's older sister. Now, Dawn looked very similar to Shari. One time during the phone calls, he even let it slip that Dawn perhaps was his original target, because he said, like, as he was talking about what was happening, he said, all I want to do is make love to Dawn. And I'm guessing when Dawn or Hilda's reaction was like, wait, what? He quickly corrects himself, like, I meant Shari. You know, it was like so creepy. It's like clearly he was stalking these girls. Now, 5 days after making the first call to the Smith family, Larry once again calls them and lets them know that Shari and he had now become one soul. He called and he spoke with Dawn, and he tells Dawn, Shari is now part of me, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Our souls are now one. Dawn actually asked him, what do you mean? You know, what does that mean for Shari? Where is she? And then he tells Dawn, don't ask any more questions and tell the police to not look for Shari anymore. Obviously, that wasn't going to happen. They weren't going to do that. And Hilda ends up speaking to him and says, please don't kill my baby girl. And he just tells Hilda not to worry, that Shari loves everyone and she misses you guys, and good night. He then hangs up the phone and they don't hear from him for days. Then on June 5th, 1985, he calls Shari's family once again, speaks with Hilda, and he starts the call off by saying, listen carefully. He then gives Hilda specific directions to this out-of-the-way house with a backyard, and he tells her, we're waiting. God chose us. Now, police immediately head to this location. You know, they want to know what's waiting for them. And Hilda, she begs the police to take her with them, but they just had a bad feeling. They were like, we can't take you. We don't know what we're going to find. And they probably knew what they were going to find, and they just didn't want Hilda to be witnessing any of that. They had a feeling it was not going to be a happy ending. So the police follow these directions, and what it turns out to be, what Larry had given them, was the precise locations to Shari's body. It was exactly where he said it was going to be, behind this like house, like an old house in the backyard. It was in this abandoned house, and it was about 28 kilometers or 18 miles away from Shari's house, which actually is not that far. Like, that would probably take, 30 minutes to get there? When she was examined, it would be revealed that she had been dead for several days, about 4 days. And when they did their calculations, when they did their further investigations, they believed that she actually died on June 1st at 4:58 a.m. And that was shortly after she wrote that letter, that last will and testament. She wrote that at 3:58. This asshole kept calling her family and taunting them for days, even though he knew Shari was dead. Now, Shari's cause of death wasn't really confirmed, but she had duct tape residue on her face, which suggested that she had suffocated to death. They also thought that she might have died of dehydration, because if she was, covered up and then just left there, that's how she could have died. Pieces of her hair was actually missing and it had been cut off because most likely it had duct tape residue on it. Now, due to the amount of days Shari's body was lying in that location, she was exposed to the elements, so there was not much forensic evidence to recover. And they couldn't definitively prove whether Shari had been or not. Also, the fact that on her hair, on her face, they found duct tape residue, but no actual duct tape, they believed that this guy, the killer, possibly knew what he was doing. I mean, guys, duct tape at a crime scene is usually one of the best things to recover fingerprints and oils and things like that. So the fact that he took it away after using it on her, he had some idea that, it could land him in trouble. It's also interesting that he left her body for days. He planned that, and he probably knew that the elements were going to destroy some of the evidence. He literally could have told them where her body was ages before she was found, but it's like he wanted the elements to destroy evidence, which, makes sense if you're trying to not get caught. Larry at first was a kidnapper, but now he murdered Shari, so he's also a murderer, but he wasn't done torturing the Smith family. Now, this next part is so sick, so cruel, and this is exactly what he wanted. He called the Smith family on the night of Shari's funeral to tell them exactly how he raped, murdered, and tortured Shari. I mean, what was so sick when I was reading this? I was like, what was his motive? He didn't want money. He didn't want, he didn't make a ransom call for anything, really. It was literally just to tell them what he was doing. He wanted an audience. He doesn't just want to commit the crime. He wants to toy with the family, toy with their emotions, get some recognition, give this poor family some hope that their child is still alive, even though when he was doing this, he probably already had murdered her. Funnily enough, the day before Shari's funeral, he actually calls the Smith family again, speaks to Dawn, and when he's speaking to Dawn, he's telling Dawn, I'm so sorry, I made this big mistake, blah, 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 I feel horrible, I want to kill myself. He's talking about how horrible he feels, and then the very next day, he does that. He literally calls and asks Dawn for forgiveness for the crime that he had committed, and then the very next day, he calls and he tells them about all the horrific things he had done to the family after they had already laid her to rest, by the way. So as they're trying to grieve and mourn, he does that. He tells Dawn on that call that he had actually let Shari make her own decisions in regards to her death. For example, he says, I let Shari choose what time she was going to die. He also gave her a choice in her method of death, whether he was going to shoot her, give her a drug overdose, or suffocating her. He says she chose the last method, being suffocation, so he wrapped the duct tape around her head and then she slowly died. I mean, he's saying this almost like a justification for his crimes. Well, I let her choose, I didn't just take it all away from her. I gave her some options. What an asshole. He then goes on to tell the family that Shari is now in heaven and God wanted her as one of his angels. And I didn't read this anywhere, but I feel like he almost chose, I don't know if he was into God, but he almost chose this God excuse because he knew that Shari's family were quite religious. So like the police normally do, they needed to come up with a profile of the suspect. So the profiler they enlisted was John Douglas, and he predicted that the killer would be an overweight white male in his 30s, possibly with a failed marriage and possibly who had sex crimes in his past. That because he, used a device most likely to hide and distort his voice, that possibly he was familiar with technology and he possibly was of above average intelligence, because he was also not one to really take chances. From listening to the phone calls that he had made, the recorded 7 phone calls, the profiler believed that he was most likely reading from a script, like everything was quite thought out. And the reason for this is sometimes during the calls, he would stumble, and instead of just continuing on, he would go back and repeat what he had already said, like almost like, oh, let me just try again with the same sentence. They truly believed he was going to kill again if he wasn't captured. He loved the power and control that came with toying with and taunting Shari's family, and he most likely would not want this feeling of power to stop anytime soon. Now, the police did attempt to lure the killer out by coming up with like a little act. They thought, okay, let's do a memorial service for Shari and let's make it this huge circus act and get media involved and get a lot of people involved. And they thought, because the killer liked Dawn so much, let's use Dawn to lure him out. Let's give Dawn a starring role in the memorial, hoping that the killer was going to show up and stand and watch. They thought he would really love and enjoy watching Dawn there be center stage. So they did. They created this big memorial service, and so many people showed up to support Shari and her family. So Dawn was given this little koala bear, one of Shari's, to walk with up to the front and lay it at Shari's grave, and to also lay some flowers there. And the reason for this was, as she would be walking up and doing this, they wanted to give the killer something to look at in case he came to the memorial service. They thought, if he saw Dawn walking with this koala up to the grave and placing it there, they thought that possibly he was going to come back after, when everyone had gone, and he would take this koala or the flowers or something as a memento for killing Shari. So they waited and waited for days, but no one ever showed up. Now, time passes, nothing really happens. And then a few weeks later, the Smiths get a phone call once again. It's from Larry. And this time the killer, he didn't want to talk about Shari. He wanted to talk about someone else. He wanted to share the location of his next victim, a little 9-year-old girl. This girl's name was Deborah May Helmick. Again, she was only 9. And on June 14th, 1985, Deborah, she was just playing outside her house. She was with her siblings, and she was honestly just playing and having a fun time with her siblings right outside the front of their mobile home. And as she's playing with them, a silver car pulls up, walks right up to Deborah, grabs her, and takes her straight to his car and then drives off. He abducted her in just broad daylight, right there in front of her siblings. As he grabbed Deborah, she was kicking and screaming, and he just grabbed her and chucked her in his car and just drove off, like no big deal. Deborah, again, like Shari, was very pretty, blonde hair, blue eyes, but because she was so young as well, she was known as very shy and very cautious. Now, luckily, there was a witness, and this witness described the abductor as a man in his 30s, a white male. He was overweight and he was wearing shorts. Now, I said siblings before. I meant to say sibling. It was just her brother that she was playing with, and her brother was only 3 years old, so there's nothing he could do. And the two of them were just playing right outside their mobile home on this small patch of grass. But their home was sort of close to the road, like 10 feet away from the road. So it's not like it was, the way I was picturing it was like a mobile home and a bunch of trailers. So I was like, how did he do that? But it was on the road. It was pretty close to the main road. Now, this witness was a man who lived in a trailer a few houses down. And he didn't really have time to respond when he saw what happened, because initially, his wife is the one that heard the scream of Deborah. So he's the one that went and peered through the trailer window, and that's when he sees what he saw. And it all happened so quick. So as soon as he saw that happen, he ran from his house to Deborah's trailer and he bangs on the door. Deborah's father was right inside the trailer. He didn't even know Deborah had been taken. He had no clue. Now, the police try their best to quickly search for and locate Deborah, but they were unable to do so. Deborah's family would soon also receive these taunting calls from the killer, and the call to Shari's family with precise directions on where to find Deborah's body didn't take place until 8 days later on June 22nd, 1985. And this would be the final call the killer would make. It's not clear why, in relation to Deborah, that the killer, or Larry, called Shari's family again instead of calling the Helmigs, Deborah's family, with the location of her body. But they believe that he just enjoyed talking to Hilda. He just liked talking to these women. And I don't know if it's because they were maybe giving him what they wanted in terms of their empathy, or, you know, being dramatic or being shocked by what they had heard. We really don't know, but he seemed to just have a connection with them. Hilda was pretty soft and feminine, and they believed that he enjoyed this. He was also always talking about God. And like I said before, I feel like he did that because he knew they were devout Christians, and he thought maybe that was going to toy with them even more. And he was also becoming cocky because on that last call, he didn't distort his voice. During that call, also before he even brought up Deborah's location, he taunted Dawn by saying, God wants you to join Shari. Like almost like she's going to be next. He goes on to say that she can't be protected forever, and it was only a matter of time before she was going to be joining Shari and being his next victim. That's when he then tells Dawn the directions on where to find Deborah's body, and then he says, Deborah is waiting. God forgive us all. I don't even know how these people, like, he's getting so cocky, and you hope that criminals get cocky because that's when they start to make mistakes. For the detectives, it was like round 2, right? So they followed the precise locations that he had given them. They find Deborah's body, and where they found her was off a dirt road behind this small bush. Her body, which was severely decomposed, lay there waiting for the police. Now, what's really sick is because she's only a small little girl. She's still a baby. And she was found wearing a tank top, shorts, and a pair of adult silk bikini briefs over her regular cotton underwear. They couldn't determine with Shari whether she was assaulted, and this clearly proves that that was a motivation for both crimes. And it's just so gross. But they also found sticky adhesive residue on her hair and her face, which also indicated that it was duct tape residue, and she too had been suffocated to death. I mean, poor baby, she was only 9 years old. So meanwhile, police are now sketching up a sketch of what they think this suspect is going to look like. And based off that witness, they drew up this bearded man, and the community was like on high alert because they were like, oh my God, who's next, you know? And also innocent men who had beards were looked at like really sus. Like, is it you? Are you the killer? You know, the whole community was just on high alert. The other men were taking precautions to shield their women and their loved ones from being the possible next victim. Police had to deal with a number of tips on the hotline, and at one point they thought it was this local meter reader, but it turned out to not be him. The police also ended up arresting 4 people who had been making false claims, and some of them were also trying to extort money from the Smiths. So now the police are pissed, right? They're trying to do everything they can to find out who this man is, so they begin combing through all the evidence once more. So now you guys remember that the note that Shari had written to her family was written on that yellow legal pad paper, right? Well, this would turn out to be Larry's biggest mistake. He practically handed his ass to the police. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this before, but the police, they basically examined this note, and they use special technology like this electromagnetic device to look at the paper and see what had been written on the paper prior to the actual note, like indentations left from previous notes. And they saw an incomplete phone number on the paper, and then they ended up finding the complete number and tracing it to a local Alabama residence. Sorry, the number that they found was for an Alabama business, but it was called from a local residence. So they found out the details of this South Carolina home, and they found out that the couple living in that home were visiting their son in Alabama, and that's why they had called this Alabama number. But they hired someone to be their house sitter while they had gone to Alabama to visit their son. This Alabama number on the notepad was their son's number, okay? And they had written it for this house sitter to contact in case of an emergency. Now, who was the couple's house sitter? None other than Larry Bell. Now, they initially called this couple the Shepherds, and they were like, hey, where were you on this day? What were you doing? And just trying to find an alibi for them. And they were like, no, we weren't even in the town. We were in Alabama visiting our son, but we did have a house sitter. So they're like, okay, well, we're just going to play you this recording of these phone calls of the killer. Like, let us know if you recognize it. So they play this recording, and immediately the couple's like, that's Larry Bell. They recognized him immediately. Then the police go and examine the Shepherds' phone records, and they found out that some of the calls that were made to the Smith family were made from that home while Larry was house sitting. Idiot. FBI go into Larry's history. They find out that he had a really bad past. He had a history of deviant sexual behavior, including making obscene phone calls, as well as the attempted kidnapping of this young woman. Exactly what the profiler said. He was also a suspect in a couple other disappearances. The 1984 disappearance of Sandy Elaine Cornett, who was the girlfriend of one of Larry's co-workers, and that of Denise Newsom Porch, who was last seen in July of 1975. And she lived in an apartment building close to where Larry lived. Both of these young women vanished in North Carolina, and till this day, they still remain missing. I mean, if you look at the profile is made of the killer, they nailed it. It was Larry. Larry was arrested on 27th June 1985, and during the search of the Shepherd's home, the home he was house sitting, they found further evidence that incriminated him. They found 6 long blonde hairs, which were most definitely Shari's. I believe they only said that they were microscopically similar to Shari's. I'm not sure if DNA actually confirmed it, but the hair didn't belong to any of the Shepherds or anyone that they knew. Now, when Larry was arrested, he denied having anything to do with any of the murders, but he didn't just deny it in the way of like, oh, it wasn't me. He was like, it wasn't me. It was the bad Larry Gene Bell. He went to trial in 1986, and he shamelessly tried to claim mental illness and claiming that he was Jesus Christ during the trial. The jury was not fooled, as it only took them 47 minutes to find him guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping of Shari Smith. He was tried separately for Deborah's murder, and the jury found him guilty on the exact same counts, and he was sentenced to death. Larry was given the choice to die by lethal injection or the electric chair, and he chose the chair. And I'm like, why? Wouldn't an injection be easier? Does anyone know? I mean, does an injection hurt a lot more, or is it like you would think that would be easier, no? Like, who wants to be electrocuted? Larry, when he was in prison, didn't have any incidents, no issues, but the whole time he acted like he was God, like he had this God complex. I wish we knew more of why he did it. Like, I mean, I know it's as simple as he wanted to kill, but I wish we just knew a little bit more. It seemed like he just woke up one day and was like, okay, I'm going to kill today. I'm sure there's more to it, and I don't know if it's just people don't want to talk about him or admit that they know him, or whether he showed signs of violence or mental issues back when he was younger or when he was even married. Like, we don't really know much. Just something to sort of explain his actions a little bit more, because I feel like that's why we are interested in these cases. What drives these people to do this? On 4th October 1996, after 10 years on death row, Larry Gene Bell died silently in the electric chair. He had no parting words as he was executed. I cannot imagine the nightmare that the Smith family even had to go through, because most of the time when people commit murders, they don't contact the family directly. That's so much worse. Like, they have to move on knowing that they've had direct contact with and connection and help in solving their loved one's murder with the killer. Now, what you would think would tear a family apart actually drew the Smith family even closer together. They established a scholarship in Shari's name, and both Hilda and Dawn wrote beautiful books about Shari. A year after her death, Dawn was crowned Miss South Carolina in 1986. She later got married and became a Christian singer-songwriter. Shari's father, Robert, stated that Her last will and testament that she had written before she died really was the thing that gave the family closure. He said that she knew where she was going, and because of her unshakable faith, she died with grace and dignity. Her writing on that piece of paper is what helped catch Larry Gene Bell and stopped him from killing any further. Cases like this, where there's no rhyme or reason behind a killing and where we don't even know much, either because it's just not reported or people don't want to come forward, or is there a reason why they don't report more on these kinds of things? These ones scare me the most, these types of cases. One day you could just be walking down the street and a random stranger just decides you're the target. Evil. Let me know your thoughts on today's case, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I will see you in the next one. Besitos. Mwah. Bye.